sat next to us. Look at Jit. That nigga froze. He froze. Boy,
Number 31. Marriages between Hamites and Israelites. If there's one thing that proves the inescapable that the Israelites were black, is the fact that so many of them had marriages with African Hamites, who we know are 100% black, if Cush, who descends from Ham, is black, and so are his brothers, Put, Canaan, and Mizraim, referred to as Egypt. Take a look at this table. These unions between Israelites and Egyptians, Canaanites, Cushites, and other Hamitic groups demonstrate that the Israelites were not only in close contact with these black nations, but also intermarried freely with them. Notably, the patriarchs such as Abraham, Judah, and Joseph, and key leaders like David, Solomon, and Moses all had unions with women from Hamitic backgrounds. These unions were accepted, further suggesting that the physical appearance and racial makeup of the Israelites would have been harmonious with that of Hamitic groups. We proved it earlier that there are 5 biblical examples of the Israelites and Hamite Egyptians looking extremely similar. Even Yahushua HaMashiach, son of Yah, has Hamitic nations in his genealogy, such as Rahab, a Canaanite. You have to now admit that several Israelites are descendants of both Israelites and African Hamites, making them black. No more denial. It is over. Let's use Moses and his Cushite wife as an example of a Hamitic-Semitic marriage. The Cushites were in modern-day Sudan, so try to picture a Nilotic woman having a child with a man of any ethnicity in the world. The child would be of mixed race, but the child would definitely have African Hamite features, such as dark skin. It's inescapable. One of the silly arguments that people like to use against the Israelites being black is saying that Moses' sister Miriam was being racist towards Moses' wife, Zipporah, who they call an Ethiopian, hence why she was punished. They're trying to argue that Miriam was punished with leprosy for hating on Moses, because his wife is black. I will correct this absolute foolishness. Firstly, Zipporah was not an Ethiopian, as in belonging to the land which we currently call the country of Ethiopia. She was a Cushite woman. The Cushites were from the area we modernly refer to as Sudan. You have to look at the original manuscripts and stop letting translations fool you. Secondly, to ever think that Miriam was talking against Moses' marriage to a Cushite because she was black is utter stupidity, and you just sound as racist as you're trying to make Miriam look. Here are 4 clear reasons as to why this punishment by Yah had nothing to do with Miriam being racist. The first reason is because Miriam and Aaron were also questioning why Yah had chosen him as the primary leader and prophet. They were challenging the role that Yah gave Moses, according to Numbers 12:2. Yah points out the unique relationship he holds with Moses, showing his displeasure with their criticism against their brother. The second reason is the blatant jealousy Miriam holds for Moses' position as a leader. This is a direct violation of the commandment, do not covet, hence this is grounds for Miriam's punishment. The third reason we know Miriam was not criticizing Moses because his wife is black is because it was an Israelite custom to marry someone of the seed of your father, and Moses was being an outlier to this custom. Examples of this include Genesis 24:3-4, where Abraham makes it clear that Isaac's wife needs to come from his own people instead of intermingling with Canaanites. Another example is Genesis 28:1-2, where Isaac gives the same instruction to Jacob, later known as Israel, telling him to marry within the Israelite heritage. Father Yah even commands Israel not to intermarry with the nations around them in case they would fall into idolatry, which did indeed happen. Other examples include Nehemiah 13:25-27, where Nehemiah rebukes Israelites for marrying foreign women, compromising the Israelite identity, and Numbers 36:6-9, where the daughters of Zelophehad are told to marry within their father's tribe. Even in the book of Tobit 4:12, it is repeated again that the Israelites should marry a woman of the tribe of their father. There are more examples, but you get the gist. Now, the fourth reason why Miriam was punished is by looking at the punishment itself. It wasn't a random punishment. It symbolized impurity and required Miriam to be removed from the camp for 7 days. The period of separation served as a public correction, reminding her, Aaron, and all of Israel of the gravity of rebellion against Yah's appointed authority. When Aaron pleaded with Moses on her behalf, Moses interceded for her, praying for her healing. Yah responded by allowing her healing, but also required the full week of separation, reinforcing both his mercy and his justice. These 4 reasons debunk that nonsense racist argument. And here's a bonus reason. Moses was black too. So was Miriam. So was Aaron. So how does that argument even make any sense? Oh, and by the way, in every circumstance where Yah is angered about a marriage, it's not based on skin color, but by Israel adopting idolatry and worshipping other gods. Yah was not angry about Moses' marriage and even punished Miriam for speaking about it. There's nothing in the Bible that bases marriage on skin color. Skin color is barely even mentioned in the Bible when describing people because they were a homogeneous people. Check yourself. Number 32. Egyptian artifacts. I've shown some of these throughout the video while speaking about the Hebrew Israelites because these are depictions of them found in Egypt. Here is the terracotta head of a Semite marked Hebrew discovered in Memphis of Egypt, which you can now find at the Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology, just in case you're butthurt and you don't believe me. Here's another angle. Oh, and here's another one. Yeah, I don't think I need to say much. We've proven the lineage from Adam all the way down to Israel, and his 12 sons are black. We've found 5 instances where a black Hamitic population and a Semitic population are proven to look similar. We have multiple Hamitic-Semitic marriages. We have the curses of Deuteronomy 28. We have melanin, and now we have artifacts from the Greco-Roman period, relatively more recent artifacts clearly showing the Israelites as a black, dark-skinned, melanated people. Oh, but don't you worry, here's a figurine dating all the way back to the 18th dynasty of Egypt, showing what these people want to call a Semitic slave. Here are some different angles. You can find this piece in the Hecht Museum in Haifa, located in that one nation state that shall not be named, which is hilarious to me because it means they're claiming this figurine as evidence of Israelite slavery in Egypt, but yet it clearly looks black, nothing like the people currently in that land. They'll make the excuse, the Israelites used to be black, but now they're white or olive-skinned, using the argument that populations change, but yet cannot apply that same logic to ancient Egypt when they know the modern Egyptian population is not the ancient population. I digress. If me and you didn't know any better, you would write it off, but I assume you can see how similar in complexion and phenotype those first artifacts are to this one made thousands of years earlier. And if you're really observant, you'd notice that the complexion of skin shown in these artifacts are similar to the comparisons used by the prophets to describe the color of Messiah. Number 33. Lachish reliefs. The Lachish reliefs are a set of Assyrian palace reliefs narrating the story of the Assyrian victory over the kingdom of Judah during the siege of Lachish in 701 BC. These are more depictions of the Israelites as how they were seen in life. Take a good look at them. Now let's compare them to the 18th dynasty and Greco-Roman artifacts found in Egypt. I assume you can see the similarities in phenotype, both looking strongly Negroid in appearance. You have to understand that the 18th dynasty Egyptians, the Assyrians, and the Greco-Roman period Egyptians are 3 separate groups who for some reason all depicted the Israelites in a similar fashion to that of a Negro. If my step-by-step logic with biblical proof within the last 31 proofs hasn't at least made you think twice about the true identity of the Israelites, maybe using your own 2 eyes should help. The proof is everywhere if you look for it. Number 34. Tacitus. Alright, let's assume you don't want to believe your eyes also.
I tell you, it just doesn't matter! It just doesn't matter!
So here's what we're going to do. We're going to use the word of a renowned 1st century Roman historian and politician called Tacitus. He is widely regarded as one of the greatest Roman historians by modern scholars. In his historical chronicle, named Histories, covering the years of 69 to 90 AD, during which the Romans invaded Jerusalem, slaughtered and enslaved the inhabitants, and destroyed the temple in 70 AD. In this book, Tacitus claims that many assured him that the Jews were descended from Ethiopians. For historical context, in the 1st century, the word Ethiopian was not specifically referring to being an inhabitant of the modern land that we now refer to as the country of Ethiopia. But the word Ethiopia was used as a general term for the landmass of sub-Saharan Africa, for the lack of a better term. Ethiopia was a term referring to the majority of the continent of Africa, meaning an Ethiopian would be a term referring to someone of African descent. This means that what Tacitus is really saying here is that many assured him that Israelites were descended from black Africans. So now, We have a Roman historian who was alive during the same century of Messiah, the disciples, and he gives us an account of many instances of people telling him that the Israelites were descended from Ethiopians, contextually meaning black Africans. I've used the Bible, I've used science, I've used Hebrew etymology, I've used paintings, I've used prophecy, I've used archaeology, and now I've used the guys who literally invaded Jerusalem and waged war with the Israelites. But I know how this goes with some of you people. They know black, they know black.
I know black, I know black, I know black. Impossible, I know black.
Number 35. I am black but comely.
I know black.
In Song of Solomon 1:5-6, the Shulamite woman describes herself as black but comely. The Hebrew word for black being used here is
shahor,
meaning black, from the root word
shaher,
which means to be dark. This word clearly denotes a dark or black complexion. The phrase but comely means yet beautiful, suggesting pride in her appearance. The tents of Kedar were known to be made of black goat hair, which further emphasizes the darkness of her skin. Go to Proof 7 to see how we know Kedar was black also. By comparing her skin to the tents of Kedar, the Shulamite woman associates her appearance with an established image of blackness in the cultural consciousness of her time. This comparison reinforces her description of herself as black and suggests a shared cultural identity or appearance with the people of Kedar. She attributes her dark complexion to being exposed to the sun, implying that her lifestyle or work kept her outside frequently. This reveals that she was likely involved in laborious outdoor work typical for people living in an agrarian society like ancient Israel. Her darker skin tone from sun exposure would have been a common characteristic among Israelites who worked outdoors, indicating that darker skin was not unusual among them. Given that Solomon, an Israelite king, had a romantic and admiring view of this woman, it would seem that darker skin was valued and beautiful among the Israelites, or maybe just Solomon, but either way it's implying that Israelites commonly had similar complexions. By proudly acknowledging her dark skin and comparing it to the tents of Kedar, the Shulamite implies that darker skin was both beautiful and respected. Since she is part of Solomon's royal narrative, this description also suggests that darker skin was not unusual or undesirable among the Israelites, supporting the notion that they were indeed a black people. Number 36. The 70 AD War and the Scattering of the Israelites. For this next point, we're going to have a quick history lesson just so everyone knows why this event is relevant in proving the true identity of the Israelites. Brace yourself. The 70 AD war against the Israelites, approximately around 40 years after Messiah's sacrifice and resurrection, culminating in the siege and destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans under the hand of Titus, was one of the most catastrophic events in Israelite history, and it was prophesied by our Messiah during his earthly ministry. Before this disastrous event, it was reported by several eyewitnesses of miraculous signs and wonders happening in and around Jerusalem before the invasions of the Romans. Cassius Dio, a 2nd century Roman historian, wrote about an event that happened to Nero in 66 AD, 4 years before the destruction. When the first workers touched the earth, blood spouted from it. Groans and bellowings were heard, and many phantoms appeared. Nero himself thereupon grasped a mattock and by throwing up some of the soil, fairly compelled the rest to imitate him. Suetonius, a 1st century Roman historian, wrote that in 66 AD, many people heard the sound of a trumpet. According to Josephus and others, there was a comet that stayed visible in the sky for nearly a year near the time of the destruction. Shortly before Jerusalem's destruction, there was an odd star that appeared and stood over the city. It resembled a sword. A couple of years before the war and before the disturbances surrounding it, the people came up to one of the feasts, and at night a very bright light shone down around the temple's altar. It was as bright as midday time, and lasted somewhat less than an hour. Those with less spiritual discernment saw this as a good sign, but those most trained in understanding holy signs thought it was a harbinger of bad things to come. They were correct. According to Sefer Yosipon, after this event, the outline of a man's face, whose beauty had never been seen in all the land, appeared above the Holy of Holies for the whole night. At one of the great feasts commanded by the laws of Moses, a cow was being led forward by a high priest to be sacrificed, and the cow stopped and gave birth to a lamb. Then As if this were not enough strange events, one of the colossal metal gates leading to an inner court of the temple, a gate that took over a dozen men to swing open or closed because of its tremendous weight, opened itself one night. It took the normal number of men to shut it again. The educated saw it as a sign that the protection and safety of their temple was being given up voluntarily by Yah, with the gate opening up as if to their enemies, the Romans. And it gets even crazier. Before I say this next sign witnessed around the time of the siege of Jerusalem, I would like to inform you that most of these signs and miracles are corroborated both by Yehudim historians and Roman historians, meaning both sides of this war saw these signs happen. This is the work of our Father in heaven. According to Josephus, Tacitus, Hegesippus, and others, a few days after one of the feasts, at about sunset, something that can only be described as divine was seen. An army composed of chariots of fire and armed horsemen were seen throughout the whole region in mid-air, wheeling through the clouds and encircling the cities. They were a great force flying across the sky near to the ground, coming against Jerusalem and all the land of Judah, all of them horses of fire and riders of fire. This was seen both by Romans and Israelites. I'll give you one more. 7 years before the 70 AD destruction of Jerusalem, when people came to Jerusalem to observe another of the feasts of Israel, in the temple, a man of the name of Yahushua ben Ananias began to cry out the words, "A voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the sanctuary, a voice against the bridegroom and the bride, a voice against all the people." He cried these words out continuously and would not stop no matter what, so eventually the Jewish leaders of Jerusalem turned him over to the Romans, who tortured him. The Roman officials had him whipped so badly that glimpses of bone showed. But the man just kept prophesying against Jerusalem, and he wouldn't stop. The Romans saw him as a man gone mad, so they released him. Years and years went by, and this man kept saying the same words. Then one day, Rome invaded. As Rome had surrounded Jerusalem and was besieging it, he was walking around speaking the same grim prophecies against the city and the people, when suddenly this man included himself in his usual words. He bellowed, "Woe once more to the city, and to the people, and to the temple," and as he added a last word, "And woe to me also," a stone hurled from the ballista struck and killed him on the spot. So, with those ominous words still upon his lips, he passed away. The Romans, under General Titus, later emperor, laid siege to Jerusalem in 70 AD. The city was surrounded for months, cutting off food and water supplies. Factions within Jerusalem, such as the Zealots, Pharisees, and Sadducees, fought each other, further weakening the city's defenses. As famine set in, conditions deteriorated, leading to desperation, cannibalism, and infighting. The Roman forces breached the city's defenses in August 70 AD, and the temple was burned and destroyed. Families were burnt alive. Children were slaughtered in front of their parents. Women and children were violated. Men were slaughtered like cattle. There were rivers of blood. According to Josephus, who witnessed the war, over 1 million people were killed. He claimed that the reason this number was so high was because Israelites and converted Gentiles were all in Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. Almost 100,000 Israelites were enslaved and transported across the Roman Empire. The survivors in Jerusalem faced enslavement, exile, or massacre. Before, during, and after this tragedy, thousands of Israelites escaped their sealed fates in Jerusalem and hid from their Roman persecutors by fleeing. Where did the Israelites flee to in 70 AD? Now, this is where I present to you, the viewer, two conclusions, both proving that the Israelites were 100% in Africa by 70 AD. The first conclusion is the one the average viewer is most likely to accept or adopt. However, I do have to let you know that I do not agree with this conclusion, and I think it is wrong based upon my research and the evidence at my disposal. I will explain why I do not believe in the first conclusion by showing you the second one, but it's still a conclusion that makes sense based on the evidence most people have seen. Here is the first conclusion. Let us assume that the country of Palestine, or the illegitimate state that has nothing to do with the biblical Israelites, is indeed the land of the Israelites, where Jerusalem was, and is the true promised land. You are an Israelite in 70 AD. Rome is outside your front door. You need to run. If you are being invaded by an enemy who is essentially a global superpower, whose heart and origin is in Europe, and who would have been vigilant for fugitive Israelites, particularly in Roman provinces, do you A. escape into Roman-occupied Europe to be immediately spotted by Roman soldiers, then get enslaved or killed, or B. go down into Egypt, the same place where Abraham, Sarah, Jacob, later known as Israel, and his entire family, Jeremiah, and Yahushua HaMashiach himself went to hide, and Yahushua HaMashiach himself hiding from Roman soldiers just like you, and the same place where it's confirmed in Scripture that Israelites who are Semitic and Egyptians who are Hamitic look extremely similar. Then from escaping into Egypt while evading Roman detection, make your way into African territories unoccupied by the Romans, in comparison to Roman-occupied Europe. I think anyone with 2 brain cells that can rub together would pick B, and that's what the Israelites would have chosen. They would have ran and gone to a land they have always went to hide. They would have blended in with the Egyptian population and evaded Roman detection while making their way into Upper Egypt, deeper into Africa, and they would have escaped Roman Egypt and ventured into Africa, eventually settling free of Roman persecution. If we're assuming Palestine is the land in which Jerusalem was in, Egypt and Africa were directly accessible from Judea by land, crossing the Sinai Desert into Egypt. Escape to Europe, on the other hand, would have required crossing Roman-controlled territory, increasing the risk of capture. Here's a fun fact. Throughout the scriptures, there are several instances of Israelites mixing with descendants of Ham, but there is not one biblical instance of an Israelite mixing with a descendant of Japheth, the progenitor of many European nations. So I think the Israelite would probably escape to the land of Ham over the land of Japheth, just saying. Also, there were already instances of Israelite worship and settlements in Africa before 70 AD. The Elephantine Temple is an example of this, which we may end up bringing up again in a future video. Anyway, refugees could integrate or seek assistance from these communities. If the land of Palestine is the land the Israelites were in during the 70 AD siege, going into Africa was the safest bet for any Israelite escaping from certain death. It's just common sense. Now, on to the second conclusion. The second conclusion is the view that very few viewers already have or are willing to adopt. The group of people who believe in this conclusion is a small group which I belong to. I believe that this conclusion is the correct conclusion based on my research and evidence at hand. The second conclusion agrees with the end result of the first conclusion. Here is the second conclusion. I do not believe that the land of Palestine is the place where the Israelites were, nor where Jerusalem was. I do not believe that land in the Levant has much to do with the Israelites at all. The land of the Israelites was not in the Middle East. Just as there is a people whose identity was erased and stolen, there is a land whose identity was erased and stolen. As I am on this platform, there are certain rules in place that stop me from saying many of the things I want to say and showing the things I want to show. So currently, I cannot show you explicitly how the identity of the true promised land was erased and stolen just like the people. But for now, what I can do is show you irrefutable proof that the Israelites were not in the Levant and did not escape to Africa via Egypt, but that the Israelites were always in Africa. Now before I show you, even if after all the irrefutable proof I show, and it doesn't make you come to the second conclusion and you still believe in the first, we are still both in agreement. We both believe that the Israelites were in Africa after the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, either by escaping into Africa or escaping further into Africa. So, no matter if you believe the first or second conclusion, even though you should believe the second after seeing the evidence, Israelites are in Africa by the 1st century. Number 37. The Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds? Yes, I'm aware I'm dropping a massive nuke on all of the Abrahamic religions by claiming that the true Holy Land is in fact not the land in the Levant that has been fought over for thousands of years, and somehow pretty much everyone in the last 2,000 years got it wrong, except a small group of people who can read manuscripts and critically think, and you're probably on your way to comment your silly laughing emojis and ooga booga comments. But before you go and do that, let me let you in on something that doesn't get talked about as much as it should. Before I say this, disclaimer, I believe in all of the Bible, including the Exodus. I see the Bible as truth, but what I do not trust is man and what they have done to Scripture. Okay, now let's talk about it. several archaeologists and researchers have confirmed that there is no archaeological evidence in Palestine of an exodus taking place from Egypt to the land of Palestine.
You need to leave!
Most biblical researchers, scholars, and archaeologists date the Exodus to either the 15th or 13th century, and guess what? No Israelite presence is found in the so-called Holy Land within those time periods. Hear it from themselves.
The Jewish history with regard to the land of Israel begins approximately 1300 BCE, before the birth of Christ. Moses leaves Egypt somewhere around 1300 BCE. There are various sort of attempts to date this. A little bit later in the century, Joshua enters the land. He crosses the Jordan River, right? So the Jewish people go out here, they pass through the Red Sea, they end up wandering around in the desert, and then they enter the land of Canaan, right, which is this whole area.
Professor Shlomo Zand, the professor of history at Tel Aviv University, was here with us the other week, and we discussed the intellectual roots of the State of Israel, Zionism. I'm delighted again to welcome Professor Zand to our program.
About the exodus from Egypt. In the time that the Bible is writing about the exodus of Jews from Egypt, the Egyptians were the owners of this land of Palestine. The Egyptians were the owners of this land of Palestine. Most of the archaeologists here arrived to the conclusion that a unified kingdom of Judah in Israel never happened. Never happened. They discovered that there were not any movement from Egypt to here in that time.
And at first, the archaeology seems to confirm the Bible stories. But not all archaeologists are so convinced that you can dig up Old Testament tales in a modern excavation. One of the leading experts has dug for years at the ancient site of Megiddo. He has big problems with the idea that the Bible is a history book for the land of Israel.
When people came here to Megiddo and other places in the Holy Land, the idea was to look for evidence for the biblical stories, to look for a decoration, to look for a manifestation. That is to say, you have the biblical story, they all took the biblical stories as the ultimate truth, and they only wanted to decorate this truth with the, beautiful finds, with the monuments, and there was no thinking about, the power of archaeology to verify the real events that took place, in the second or in the first millennia.
So biblical archaeology rubber-stamped Old Testament history.
Exactly.
The biblical archaeologists thought they had found evidence for the magnificent kingdom of David and Solomon, which the Bible says held sway in the 10th century BC. If you believe the Book of Kings, this was when much of the Old Testament was written down. But Israel Finkelstein says the dates simply don't match.
We are standing now in what's called the Solomonic, quote-unquote, gate of Megiddo. So this monument, was described as Solomon from the days of Solomon, and a manifestation of the grandeur and the glamour of the United Monarchy. However, the gate probably dates to the 8th century BC, and Solomon is supposed to be in the 10th century. So you have 2 centuries between Solomon as an historical figure, and there was a Solomon, and the gate, which is much later.
So biblical archaeology got the dating of the Solomonic Gate completely wrong.
Solomonic Gate and many other monuments, because the whole system of dating of the strata, archaeological strata, and the monuments related to the period of the United Monarchy, a little bit before and a little bit later, was, in my opinion at least, completely wrong.
This is a bombshell. Archaeology now tells a completely new story of Jewish origins. No big kingdom, as the Bible tells us, no exodus from Egypt either, just scattered small settlements in the hills. In the north, these develop into a kingdom called Israel. In the south, there's another called Judah. Its capital is Jerusalem, but it's not at all as the Bible tells us.
First of all, you look at Jerusalem, and what you see is not a great city, a capital of a great empire. You see a small village, very limited in number of people.
A small village?
A small village, very limited in number of people. There's almost nothing there, few pieces of shirts here and there, and not much more than that. And then also, even more important than that, in order to have a text, so powerful and so elaborate and so advanced. You need to see evidence of inscriptions. Archaeology does not provide this evidence. I mean, literacy comes mainly in inscriptions and writing and scribal activity. All this comes much, much later, centuries after the days of David and Solomon.
More bombshells. We lose not just King David and the Exodus, but all the Genesis stories too. Abraham's promise, Isaac and Jacob, all of them now have a question mark beside them.
Those question marks only exist if you believe that the current land of Palestine is the true Holy Land. It's funny because both of those archaeologists I showed who did work in the Levant, Israel Finkelstein and Dr. Shlomo Sand, are in fact Israelis themselves, born to Ashkenazi Jewish families, but yet they still didn't lie to the public and say they found evidence of the Exodus happening to the land of Palestine, but told the truth that they have found practically nothing. You'd think that they would at least fake some type of archaeological evidence of the Exodus happening in the Levant to keep the Zionist myth and Zionist state alive, but alas. Well, at least now you know why you have a bunch of atheists running around saying that the Bible isn't even real and the Exodus never happened, because there is literally no archaeological evidence of the Israelites going to the Levant during the Exodus. It doesn't exist. As I said, the Exodus was a real event that did indeed happen, but it was not to the current state of Israel, and we can prove this using the Bible. Time for another lesson.
So far, there is no documented evidence about the Exodus.
There is a complete absence of any external written documents testifying to Israel's presence and subjugation in Egypt, to her migration from the land, or to her conquest of Canaan and her settlement there.
Exodus did not happen in the way that it is described in the text on the background of the 13th century BC.
But is promoted heavily by forces in academia and the media, for religious and political reasons.
In the 15th century, before the Common Era, the entire Israelite nation migrated out of slavery in Egypt across the Red Sea, doing its thing, through the desert to enter 40 years later the land of Canaan from the east. The land of Canaan being the modern state of Israel, Palestinian territories.
This official version of the biblical story has in recent times faced harsh criticism from scholars and historians, who have pointed to the overwhelming lack of archaeological and historical evidence, and to the major historical inconsistencies and holes in the story, as proof that this story in the Bible is fabricated. For example, why would the Israelites need to cross any sea to get to the Sinai?
Here we are, the Red Sea. Now all we gotta do is swim across.
When the water barrier separating today Egypt from the so-called Sinai Desert was prior to the artificial construction of the Suez Canal in the 19th century, mostly a dry land that could simply be crossed on foot. Which sea were the Hebrews crossing? How could the Hebrews wander for 40 years in the so-called Sinai Desert and safely settle in Palestine, Israel, when this entire region in the proposed time of the Exodus was under total Egyptian control and was heavily fortified to protect Egypt against invading Asiatics attacking from the east? How do you escape Pharaoh by settling in one of his colonies in the east?
And Canaan of that time was an Egyptian province administered by Egyptian garrisons, where 50 Egyptian soldiers were enough to pacify an area.
Why didn't the Egyptians attack the Hebrews multiple times during the 40 years of wandering? Since the Sinai was not only under total Egyptian control and considered Egypt minor, but was also located only a few miles from Egypt. Why not just finish the Hebrews off if they are already wandering within Egyptian borders? How did the Sinai even accommodate the millions of people that we're told roamed this area for 40 years? Where are the 11 million gallons of drinking water that we today know would be necessary to sustain on a daily basis the millions of Hebrew migrants? How could this tiny area even cover such a large multitude of people?
And for heaven's sake, did we need archaeological work to confirm that an exodus of 2 million was problematic? It had already been calculated long ago that if they were marching, say, 8 across, then when the first ones got to Sinai, half of the people were still in Egypt. And I think it was Bishop Colenso who calculated around 150 years ago the amount of, let's say delicately, residue that many people would have deposited in the Sinai over a period of 40 years, and he concluded that the Sinai wilderness should be fertile.
These are only a handful of the major historical inconsistencies that have been found in the official version of the biblical Exodus out of ancient Egypt. Some of these holes in the biblical story have forced even scholars from the religious community to abandon the traditional literal reading of the Exodus as a historical account.
The archaeological and extra-biblical textual evidence shows that the larger-than-life stories cannot be read literally as history,
and instead view the narratives in the book of Exodus as moral accounts, teaching ethics and morals, rather than actual history.
These are stories that still resonate with us, stories about liberation from tyranny, about the power of an apparently insignificant people to change the course of history, about a new Israel, a promised land here, and now.
Meanwhile, admitting that the Exodus, if it really happened the way that scholars for the past centuries have claimed that it did, would simply be impossible.
So Rabbi Wolpe, what did you say?
I said that the Exodus certainly didn't happen the way the Bible depicted it, assuming that it was a historical event in any description. I think that if you look at it scientifically, it's virtually indefensible to make the Bible's case.
But no scholar, neither from the past nor the present, neither from the religious nor the secular world, neither from the maximalist camp nor the minimalist, has ever dared to question the scholars themselves in their presumptuous reading and interpretation of the biblical text. No biblical historian or researcher has ever dared to suggest that maybe the biblical text isn't really the problem.
Is anything in there historical fact?
Very little, probably.
But that the problem maybe lies in the way that these ancient documents have been interpreted for the past centuries. Maybe the Exodus narratives do in fact contain a lot of verifiable historical truths that can be proven with real, tangible material evidence, but that the text might have been completely misread or misinterpreted, and maybe deliberately. The Hebrews entered Egypt in the time of the biblical patriarch Joseph, who at the time of their immigration to this country occupied the second highest position in Egyptian politics. During his lifetime, they enjoyed a relatively good life in Egypt and benefited greatly from his high status in Egyptian society. They lived peacefully in the country and were settled in a region that is referred to in the Bible as Goshen.
And thou shalt dwell in the land of Goshen.
In this region, they lived a comfortable lifestyle for generations and increased greatly in number and influence in Egyptian society.
Joseph weeps, he reveals his identity in a very moving scene, and ultimately the family is relocated to and reunited in Egypt, where they live peacefully and prosperously for some generations.
This comfortable lifestyle continued up until the arrival of the Pharaoh of Exodus 1.
Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph.
This particular Pharaoh began to exploit the Hebrews and put them through hard labor, not only for material gains, but primarily to inhibit their growing population.
And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply.
The Hebrews grew too numerous. They might have risen against us.
But when this strategy did not have the desired effect, and the Hebrews continued to grow in population and manpower, Pharaoh resorted to a much more brutal strategy: infanticide. Every firstborn Hebrew male child must be killed at birth.
And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, Every son that is born ye shall cast into the river.
The infanticide campaign was soon implemented throughout all of Egypt, and every firstborn male child among the Hebrews was killed by being seized at birth and thrown into the river.
So the Pharaoh enlists all of the people to annihilate the Israelites by drowning all newborn males in the Nile River.
In the midst of these events, a special child is born somewhere in the Hebrew neighborhoods. A child whose mother attempts to save his life from certain death by putting him in a basket and throwing the basket into an ambiguous river, referred to in Exodus 2:3 simply as the river, Hebrew Yeor, and meaning specifically river. Not ocean, not sea, but only river. This systematically neglected detail in the Hebrew text will be very important soon.
The fortified city of Pi-Ramesses, very much like Pitom Ramses, was rebuilt in the early 13th century on the site of the old Hyksos capital. There was a capital, Avaris. They had moved the capital up to the Delta region. Now in the 13th century, this is being rebuilt, and that's in the area of Goshen.
This also narrows down the river in Exodus 1 and 2, the river that the Hebrew children were drowned in, which Moses' mother placed the baby basket in, and which Pharaoh's daughter picked up the basket from, to the Nile of Egypt, the only river in the region, and the only river in all of Egypt.
So the Pharaoh enlists all of the people to annihilate the Israelites by drowning all newborn males in the Nile River. And this leads then to the account of the birth of Moses and his exposure to the Nile River. He's hidden away for 3 months and set among the bulrushes at the edge of the Nile River. Pharaoh's daughter will eventually discover him, adopt him, and name him Moses.
Four distinct terms are used in the Hebrew text to identify the river of Egypt: Mayim, Yeor, Nahar, and Yam. Mayim. As the Hebrew plural for water, this word has no specific meaning and is used generally in the Hebrew Bible to identify any significant body of water. Nahar. Another general term. This word is used in the Bible to describe rivers. Yeor, a non-Semitic term of ancient Egyptian origin, most likely deriving from a dialect that was used in the city of Memphis. In every appearance of this term in the ancient Egyptian sources, it is used exclusively to identify the Nile River. Similarly, also in the Pentateuch, the word Yeor is used exclusively to identify the Nile River, and particularly the branches and canals of the Nile. The fourth term is Yam. Although the etymology of this word indicates that it was used to describe a swamp-like river, and not necessarily a sea or an ocean, as it is usually translated.
But the name Yam Suf, Reed Sea, implies a more marsh-like setting rather than the open sea.
This word is used in many parts of the Bible to describe different types of water streams, from the streams of the Nile and the Euphrates, to the stream of the brass laver inside Solomon's temple. And from Exodus 10, Yam becomes the prefix in the proper name that is given to the Nile River in the Hebrew Bible, Yam Suf. The word Suf simply means reeds, and is meant to describe the reeds that grew vastly in the Nile Delta in ancient times, and were used for many purposes by the Egyptians, including making papyrus and building boats. The first appearance of this word in the book of Exodus is in Exodus 2:3, in the story of Moses' mother placing Moses' basket among the reeds of the Nile River.
And she laid it in the flags by the river's brink.
The text uses suf here as a literary tool to describe the physical characteristics of the river that carried Moses' basket to Pharaoh's palace. Located in the time of Pharaoh Seti in the city of Memphis, on the borders of the Nile. And again 2 verses later in Exodus 2:5 to identify the river that Pharaoh's daughter found the basket in.
And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it.
The Nile being the only river in this region, scholars naturally identify the Reed River in Exodus 2:3 and Exodus 2:5 with the Nile of Egypt.
Again, there's no doubt about that because Moses' mother placed his basket amongst the reeds, same word. Not among the reds, the reeds.
And it's not until we reach Exodus 13, verses 17 and 18, that the standards suddenly change. In the same Reed Sea that was explicitly identified with the Nile River in every other previous verse, suddenly changes identity. And the Reed Sea, Yam Suf, from Exodus 13, is always translated as the Red Sea.
And it came to pass, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God led them not through the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. But God led the people about, through the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea.
Based entirely on an old translation error, when the Hebrew Bible was being translated from Greek to English, and a scribal error translated Reed Sea as the Red Sea. The Reed Sea Yam Suf would later be confused with the sea that the ancient Greek cartographers knew as the Erythraean Sea, the sea between the Horn of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, the modern-day Red Sea. And in spite of scholarly recognition of this scribal error,
when the Greek translators took the Hebrew Yam Suf and translated it into Greek, they translated it as Red Sea instead of Reed Sea. So we've been stuck with a faulty translation for over 2,000 years.
the Red Sea mistranslation of the Hebrew Yam Suf is still very prominent in the modern translations of the Bible and is heavily supported in academia and the media.
There's a sea ahead and an army behind! Ready yourselves!
Where are you from?
West of here.
Where are you going?
East.
Where are you from?
West of here.
The land of Canaan being the modern state of Israel, Palestinian territories.
Where are you going?
East.
The Red Sea mistranslation of the Hebrew Yam Suf is not coincidental, but strategic, and is meant to give readers the impression that the Hebrews, on the exodus out of Egypt, migrated east and crossed the Red Sea somewhere at the Gulf of Aqaba. This would locate by default the area that is known in the Bible as the Holy Land, in which the Hebrews migrated to after leaving Egypt, somewhere in northern Arabia, or perhaps the Mediterranean, where we find today Palestine, Israel.
The land of Canaan being the modern state of Israel, Palestinian territories.
A proper reading and translation of Exodus 13 would lead our search for biblical history south of Egypt. It would expose the claimed Middle Eastern origin of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is also the foundation of all of Western civilization and culture. And it would completely undermine the validity of the core historical claims that have been used now for more than half a century to justify the existence of a notorious state in the Mediterranean.
You know why we're called Jews? Because we come from Judea. Jacob and his 12 sons roamed these same hills of Judea and Samaria 4,000 years ago.
The Hebrew Bible, for the past 3,000 years, has actually been teaching that the Israelites, on their emigration out of ancient Egypt, actually crossed the Nile River and then migrated along this same Nile River to penetrate the great desert that this river went through. And if the Hebrews migrated along the Nile River, and months after having already left Egypt, were still positioned in a region where they had access to the Nile River, such a migration could never have led them east of Egypt or to Palestine, but only south, into Africa and into Ethiopia, where we in the coming episodes will find the true biblical Holy Land and real biblical history. This is the hidden biblical exodus from ancient Egypt to the Holy Land of Ethiopia.
Then followed the Nile River system. They did not go north through a hostile Egypt. They went south. And the Nile, of course, divides into two branches, the Blue Nile and the White Nile. The White Nile rises in Uganda. The Blue Nile rises in Lake Tana in Ethiopia. And Lake Tana in Ethiopia is the center, the absolute center of the area in which the Ethiopian Jews live.
Wow.
And suddenly it all began to make sense.
Oh, what are you doing? You're not the thinker.
If you are an honest intellectual, by this point, you should be scratching your head and starting to ask questions. Maybe questions like whether the entire world has been lied to for the last 2,000 years by a malicious empire that tortured and killed the Messiah, invaded the real Holy Land, and then decided to make their own fake Holy Land, thus hijacking the identity of the Israelites for power, political and religious gain, controlling the world narrative, and many other reasons. Hint, hint. Now, you are aware of my viewpoint that the land of Canaan is in East Africa, and that the Israelites were always in Africa, whether it be in Egypt, the land of Cush, or their homeland in the land we modernly call Ethiopia, specifically around the Tigray region of Ethiopia. We can prove that this is the case using Abraham and more mistranslations of the Bible the enemy has created to lead us away from truth. Number 38, Abraham went south. Genesis 12:4-9 describes the promise that Yah gave to Abraham about a land to be inherited by his descendants. Take a quick read. Now, notice, when detailing Abraham's journey to Egypt, the scripture makes no reference to Abraham moving westward along the Sinai Peninsula, like most think. Instead, we read that Abraham built an altar, then continued towards the Negev before heading to Egypt. The Negev or Negeb has been translated as south, but yet again, this is another mistranslation, as the actual meaning of the Hebrew word Negeb is desert, from a root word meaning to be dry or to be parched, and therefore in the first instance implying the dry or parched regions. Hence, in the Septuagint, it is usually translated eremos, meaning desert. So just to clarify, the word Negeb denotes dryness, aridity, or parched land. It's consistently used in Scripture to describe a geographical region characterized by these conditions, a desert. Thus, the core definition of Negeb is tied to terrain and environment, not directionality. The association of Negeb with south stems from the misidentification of biblical Jerusalem and surrounding regions by later translators and scholars who located biblical Jerusalem in the modern-day area claimed by the modern state of Israel. This misidentification caused translators to align Negev with the southern part of this territory, even though its true meaning does not support such a conclusion. This is also the reason why the modern Negev desert, which would literally mean the desert, has its name. This desert was named the Negev Desert due to centuries of misinterpretation and political motivations to align the geography of modern Israel with the biblical narrative. You remember how I told you earlier how this land is an imposter land? After the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, Jewish, not Israelite, but Jewish scholars began relocating biblical geography to the regions they inhabited, centering it on Palestine. They identified the southern dry region of this land as the Negev based on its aridity and assumed it was the same as the Negeb mentioned in the Bible. Then, during the Byzantine and Crusader periods, European pilgrims perpetuated the misidentification of biblical locations in the Holy Land as well because of those earlier Jewish scholars. This reinforced the notion that the southern desert in modern Israel was the Negev of Scripture. Then, during the 20th century, as part of the effort to establish a connection between modern Israel and biblical history, the name Negev was officially adopted for the southern desert of the region. This naming served as a political and cultural statement to reinforce the claim that the land matched the biblical narrative. To reiterate, the modern Negev desert was named due to centuries of misinterpretation and political motivations to align the geography of modern Israel with the biblical narrative. However, the biblical Negev refers to an arid, dry region near the true land of Canaan, which evidence places in East Africa, not the Middle East. Do you want to know where the real Negev is? I'll let revisionists handle this one.
Traditional biblical scholarship has identified this legendary Great Desert with Egypt's eastern peninsula, the region known today as the Sinai. Called the Sinai Desert because of a medieval belief that this was where biblical Mount Sinai was located. Egypt's eastern peninsula has been erroneously associated with biblical Mount Sinai and Sinai Desert for centuries. In ancient Egypt, the Sinai was a mining area for the Egyptians, who used to mine turquoise in this region and used to call it Mafkat, the land of turquoise. This area was under Egyptian control as far back as the First Dynasty. It was also a popular passage for Bedouins moving between Egypt and the ancient Near East.
Again, plenty of extra-biblical as well as biblical evidence of constant moving back and forth between Palestine and Egypt, particularly in times of famine.
This differs very much from the Great Desert that is described in the Old Testament, and which the Bible describes as a great and treacherous desert that was located outside of Egyptian borders and control, and which took the Hebrews months to migrate across before reaching Mount Sinai.
In the third month, when the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day came they into the wilderness of Sinai.
The only desert in the entire region that fulfills the biblical description given of the great and terrible wilderness of the Exodus is the Saharan Desert. As the largest hot desert on the planet, with an area of 9.2 million square miles and covering more than 30% of the entire African continent, it is no wonder why the Hebrews called the Sahara the Great Desert. For the same reason that the Sahara in modern times is called Al-Sahara al-Kubra, the Great Desert, a title identical to the one used in the Bible. This impenetrable wilderness took the Hebrews many months to migrate across. They began their migration in Egypt and migrated along the Nile before reaching Mount Sinai in Ethiopia. Here we have an important clue, the Nile, which the Bible tells us ran across the wilderness of the Exodus. This description could never apply to Egypt's eastern peninsula, which has no rivers running through it, much less the Nile River. After reaching Mount Sinai, the Hebrews were banned from entering the Promised Land and were ordered to wander in the desert for 40 years. This is another impossibility for the modern Sinai Desert, which the Hebrews, for many different reasons, could never have migrated within for 40 years because of the sheer size of this area and its proximity to the claimed Mount Sinai. The southeastern parts of the Sahara represented the edge of the borders of ancient Israel, where the land of Israel ended, and the great desert between Israel and neighboring countries to the north, such as the Philistines and the Egyptians. This region was called the Negev. The etymology of the word Negev is dry, something that is dry or barren, and scholars have interpreted this word to denote a desert of some kind. The Bible describes the Negev as the dry region between the land of Israel and the great wilderness leading to Egypt. This has led scholars to identifying the southern desert regions of modern-day Israel-Palestine as the biblical Negev. And for this reason alone, the word Negev is many times translated as the south, to fit the geography of modern-day Israel-Palestine. The real meaning of the word Negev is actually desert wilderness, and this word is used as a flexible cardinal point to describe the desert regions between ancient Israel and ancient Egypt. An example of this can be seen in Genesis 12, where the word Negev is used to describe Abraham's journey from Canaan towards Egypt. Here, the word Negev is usually conveniently translated as the south, to imply that Abraham had to move south from modern-day Israel to reach Egypt. This gives the impression that biblical Canaan could only have been located somewhere north of Egypt, somewhere in modern-day Palestine, Israel. The dilemma starts only when few passages later, in Genesis 13:1, we're told about Abraham's journey from Egypt back to Canaan. Here, the same word Negev that was used to describe Abraham's migration from Canaan to Egypt is used again to describe his migration from Egypt to Canaan. To avoid suspicion, the word Negev is usually translated here as a name for a specific region, and not as the south. After all, if Abraham on his journey from Palestine had to go south to reach Egypt, and then on his journey back from Egypt to Palestine again had to go south, that would be a clear contradiction in the biblical text. The real meaning of the word Negev here is simply the dry region between the land of Israel and the great wilderness leading to Egypt. That is, the southeastern parts of the Saharan desert. And when Abraham migrated from Canaan, he had to go through this region to enter the great wilderness. And on his journey back from Egypt to Canaan, he again had to go through the same Negev to return back to Canaan.
You noticing how much we're being deceived by these Bible translations? Anyway, we then read of Abraham going down to Egypt. In Hebrew, wayerd, for historical context in ancient times in this region, sense of direction was determined by the flow of the Nile River, which flowed from southern Africa to Egypt towards the Mediterranean. Hence why you have Lower Egypt at the top of Africa in what we call the north today, and Upper Egypt further into Africa in what we call the south today. As Bible researcher Avner Ramu writes in his book, Canaan, Oops, Wrong Country, when coming out of Egypt, one may experience a sensation of going up only in a southward direction, if not by any other method than by watching the flow of the Nile River. So let's do some critical thinking now. If Abraham was going down into Egypt, it would not mean Abraham was going from Arabia to Egypt, which is an east to west to south journey anyway, but it would only mean him going from southern Africa into the north. This means Abraham went down into Egypt from the south. But what does this mean? This means that not only the land of Canaan, but even the land of Ur, where Abraham originates, is actually south of Egypt, the same direction Moses and the Israelites traveled to after crossing the Yam Suf, the Nile River, south. This then brings into question everything we have been taught about the Bible, the Israelites, and who they are, and early world history in general. The world is being fooled, and it is all due to the fact that people do not want to look at the manuscripts and study the Hebrew words being used. So translators can easily slip in mistranslations and no one will bat an eye. And all the mistranslations I've shown you thus far aren't the only ones. There are way more that I'll show at another time. I told you there is a conspiracy at hand. Maybe the biggest conspiracy of all time. Number 39. All animals are in Africa. All the animals that are in the Bible are in the continent of Africa, and many of them appear only in Africa. It's that simple. I mean, honestly, Messiah was called the Lion of Judah. And you want to tell me that it was because there was a bunch of lions roaming in Palestine? Let's be for real. Anyway, at this point, I'm starting to get lazy, so I'm going to refer you to a clip from a man I highly respect for his biblical and Israelite research. His name is Robert Dalton, and here is a conversation he has with Dinano regarding the animals of the Bible.
The animals, like I touched on before, you have to ask yourself, well, what happened to the animals? Was there some type of cataclysmic apocalyptic event that happened in the land of Israel so that all these animals, they either got wiped out, or was there a mass migration of these animals?
That's the other thing they bring up.
Yeah, but what happened? Did a meteor hit Israel and it just killed all these animals? Like dinosaurs are gone now? We still have lions and elephants and leopards and hippos and zebras and wildebeests and buffaloes and giraffes and hyenas and wild dogs and wolves and all these animals that are in Africa right now, but these animals that are described in the Bible are not in Israel. So when you look at the Bible and you see in the Bible the word ostrich, hyena, jackal, dog, wolf, lion, leopard, elephant, you see an ass, and you see a wild ass. You say, well, I know a donkey is an ass, but what is a wild ass? A wild ass is a zebra. If you Google wild ass Somalia, you're going to see this animal looks like a hybrid between a zebra and a donkey. You say, well, I know what a bullock is and a bull, but what is a wild bull? What is a wild bull? And I'm looking at what a bull is and a bullock, but then there's a Hebrew word for wild bull. Well, a wild bull is your African buffalo, your wildebeest. You look at the constant use of the word ivory in the Bible, shin, S-H-E-N, and shin habim. And these words signify that there must have been elephants in the land. So where are the elephants in Israel? In the Old Testament, in the book of Numbers, God tells the Israelites what they can and cannot eat, which animals are unclean and clean. And it says one of the animals that are clean to eat is the camel opard. And the camel opard, or camelopardus, which is a scientific name for a giraffe, is in the Bible, in the Greek Septuagint. And the reason why they call it the camel opard in the Greek is because the word pard means leopard and the word camel means camel. So the giraffe looks like a tall camel with spots, leopard spots. And then I used to wonder when I read my Bible, I said, why do I see the word unicorn in my Bible? And then I had to understand how the Catholic Church and the Latin speakers, that they changed the word rhinoceros and monocorus. They took that out when they started to introduce the Latin Vulgate. The Catholic Church and the Latin speakers said, we can't have people reading this Bible and it says rhinoceros, because they're going to say, well, in the land of Israel, there is no rhinoceros.
What's the proof of that?
It's in the Bible.
It was first called this, and then after a certain period of time, when the Latin people picked up on it, it was then changed to unicorn.
Yeah, so if you Google Greek Septuagint, and you can do the Greek English version, you can Google the King James Bible version before 1611, before they started to implement a lot of these changes. You will see in the Greek Septuagint Bible and in many of the old Latin Bibles, in the footnotes, you'll see where they have the word unicorn. In the footnote on the side or on the bottom, it'll say rhinoceros. And you won't notice unless you do your due diligence and research these things. And one of the things we have to also understand is that when you're dealing with animals of the Bible, like the word lion and bear, a lion and a leopard, you have to understand that a lion is an apex predator. Sure. And so the lion has to have animals to prey on. And they have to have a habitat, including the elephant, including the ostrich, including the giraffe. They all have to have a habitat that they're living in and things to eat. And we know that lions, they don't run around eating rabbits and rodents and cats and dogs and small things, small little game animals. They're killing giraffes, wildebeests, African buffaloes, zebra, all these things. You see the hyenas hanging around the scene. So when we look at these things, you have to look at the aspect of why am I not seeing these things in the Bible? And when you also look at the word bear, people say, well, there's no bear in Africa around. And that's well, if you look at the Atlas bear lived in North Africa, and they actually had what they call the African bear, which was twice the size of the Atlas bear, that lived in sub-Saharan Africa, and they actually found in Ethiopia, in Uganda, in Kenya. In Kenya, they call it the Nandi bear, the Nandi tribe. There's a Nandi tribe in Kenya that you see pictures of them with the British pointing at a bear, and the British have their guns pointing at the bear. But even in South Africa, they have a museum and a site that they have found a plethora of bear skeletons in South Africa, along with the okapi and elephants.
Where's this site so that it's easy for someone to look it up?
Langham Bay. I could text you the link. People that follow me on YouTube, they'll see me talk about these things. But this proves that in history that these animals, at least the bear, did exist alongside with lions and the big five. So if they existed, let's say 100 to 1,000 years ago in South Africa, then that means that all the animals that are in the Bible can be found in sub-Saharan Africa.
Number 40, Israelite presence in Africa. Maybe you're really hard-headed.
Oh, hell.
And you still can't accept that you and the entire world has been lied to about the true location of the Holy Land where the Israelites actually resided. Maybe the proof that Moses and the Israelites crossed the Yam Suf for the Exodus down into Ethiopia isn't enough. Maybe the proof that Negeb means desert and Abraham traveled down into Egypt from deeper Africa isn't enough. Maybe the countless mistranslations aren't enough. And maybe the 39 proofs prior to this one aren't enough. You still don't want to believe the Holy Land is Africa. Okay, fine. Well, how about this? How about we look at the evidence of the Elephantine Israelite temple dating all the way back to the 6th century BC, over 600 years before the Israelites were scattered in 70 AD? Yes, there is proof of an Israelite temple in Upper Egypt through archaeological findings of papyrus sources since 1911. You want to know what the temple is called?
So it's called the Temple of Yahweh, of Yahah or Yahu. It's never spelled with the tetragram as we are more accustomed to seeing, but it is that the deity, the Jewish deity, if you will.
The temple was referred to as the Temple of YH, which leads scholars and researchers to try to infer the vowels between these two letters. One of the possible options is YAHU,
Yahoo,
which is the most likely, as we know the Elohim of the Hebrews and of the heaven and earth is called Yahuwah from the Tetragrammaton. The phonetic rendering of YH as Yahu matches the Hebrew theonym for the Israelite God, and as we know, this was a temple where they worshipped Yahuwah. But why is the name YAHU important? Maybe because the oldest building in Ethiopia is a temple with the same name. It is referred to as the Temple of Yeha, but the actual name is the Temple of YH, the same exact name as the one in Elephantine. As I said earlier, the name Yeha is the guesswork of scholars and researchers trying to fill the vowels between the letters Y and H, but the correct name would be Yahu, as in Yahuwah. This temple dates all the way back to around the 8th century BC, but it is highly possible it was built earlier. Researchers and archaeologists have conveniently associated this temple with moon worship and paganism due to statues found at the site, but this is easily explained by the influx of Sabaean culture in the 6th to 5th century BC, introducing moon worship and pagan iconography to the site. Similar shifts are also seen in Israelite history, where foreign influences led to syncretism or outright idolatry, e.g. Baal and Asherah worship during the monarchic period. Maybe you're not convinced. How about the fact that this temple fits the exact dimensions given to us in 1 Kings 6 in regards to Solomon's temple? The Yeha or Yahu temple in Ethiopia exhibits structural features akin to those described in Solomon's temple, such as the proportional dimensions matching biblical descriptions, a walled complex with a central sanctuary reminiscent of the Holy of Holies, and also the fact that oral traditions and Ethiopian claims suggest the Yeha temple housed sacred artifacts, potentially including the Ark of the Covenant. So we have two temples in Africa, both with the phonetic rendering of YH, which would have been Yahu, and the one in Ethiopia, which we have biblically proven is the true Holy Land, fits the exact dimensions of the Solomonic temple. I am not claiming that the Yeha temple is indeed Solomon or Herod's temple, but the fact that this temple is named after the Most High is said to have held the Ark of the Covenant and fits the biblical dimensions given to us in Scripture is fascinating. This is clear evidence of Israelite presence in Africa and in Ethiopia specifically, but we're not done. In the book Anacalypsis by historian Godfrey Higgins, Higgins records that a man of the name of Claudian in his time referred to the Abyssinians of Abyssinia, which is the old name for the modern land of Ethiopia, as Judai. It is possible that the Claudian he is referring to is Claudius Claudianus, a late Roman poet active around the late 4th and early 5th centuries. This would make sense as he is using a Latin word to describe the Abyssinians, and Latin was the language of the Romans. The Latin term Judai is the plural form of Judaeus, which refers to the people from the region of Judea or those who follow the Israelite faith. The word Judaeus itself comes from the Latinized form of the Greek Iudaios, which also meant Yehudi or a person from the land of Judea. Higgins goes on to elaborate that the Abyssinians likewise spoke the Chaldee or Syro-Chaldee language, so the Ethiopians were being referred to as Yehudim during the time of the Romans. And this is corroborated by Tacitus, who was informed by many that the Israelites descended from black Africans. Very interesting. To put the final nail in the coffin, Hermann Moll writes about the history of religious succession in Africa, and it starts with Judaism. He says, and I quote, Judaism was the religion of ancient Africans for a long time and succeeded by Christianity, but Mohammedanism prevailed in the 108th year of the Hijrah, when all the Jews, Christians, and professors of the African religion that could be found were put to death. Yet in process of time, their intestine quarrels made them neglect Muhammad's law and revolt from the Caliph of Baghdad, for which they were severely punished by the Mohammedan caliphs, who caused all their books to be burnt on suspicion that the knowledge of the arts and sciences prompted them to contemn Muhammad's law. Wait, so did Hermann Moll just tell us that the ancient Africans were following Torah and Israelite tradition before they were ever Muslim or Christian? Isn't that something?